Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the current early access build of Crest. This is a God game developed by Eat, Create, Sleep that was originally released in early access in April of last year. And as I'm taking a look at it right now, which is May 4th, they are gearing up for the next big release of content, which is going to be the Faith module that comes out in June. And the current plan is to release the full game this year at some point, but they don't really have anything other than this year. Also, full disclosure, they actually sent me a review copy to take a look at here, so I do appreciate that. Because honestly, I wouldn't have known this game even existed unless they reached out to me directly and said, hey, would you like to take a look at our game? And it's actually a pretty interesting premise. The idea is that you play as a god, but you can't actually control anything. You can only issue commandments, and your villagers, or your followers I should say, actually have something of a mind of their own, and they can choose to follow or not to follow your commandments. They may even take issue with some of those commandments. It's actually kind of interesting to think about the possibilities that could cause, where you might issue a commandment and they actually interpret it the wrong way, and they do the exact opposite of what you wanted them to do, or any number of things like that. And when you combine that with the actually pretty interesting art style, where it's very, I guess voxel is the closest way I can describe it. It's rather blocky and cartoony, but at the same time, it's actually got kind of a charm to it that's kind of hard to describe. You just have to look at it and see it for yourself. It is certainly bright and colorful and distinct, and the interface itself is extremely clean. In fact, I'd argue it's almost too clean. You don't really know for sure exactly what every button does, because the game doesn't really tell you, and you have to hover over it and see what the actual tooltip says, which is apparently improved over previous versions of the early access build, because earlier on in its development it actually didn't even have tooltips, so you had basically no idea what you were doing. So it's good to see they've improved that. But once you get past the rather interesting visuals that actually lend the game a lot of charm, even though they aren't particularly impressive in terms of pure graphical quality, you find that there's not really much in the way of sound design. There's music, which is actually fairly good. It's got definite tribal influences and definitely fits very, very well with the game, so that's greatly appreciated. But other than that, there's sound effects that are kind of hard to decipher. I'm not entirely sure what all of them mean yet, and they're fairly indistinct, so it's hard to decipher them anyway. But there's no voice acting, so I can't really comment on that right now. But of course, all of that is subject to change. This is still in early access, obviously. What has me concerned, however, is the actual gameplay, because there's barely any story in this. It's basically, you are a deity, and you have crafted these things called humans, and you're trying to lead them to prosperity. The way you do that is that you cannot directly interfere with anything. The only thing you can do is issue commandments, and they will either follow them or misinterpret them, or they will outright ignore them depending on the situation. You create these commandments by going to the word tablet, selecting the object, target, and action, and just dragging them into the template, and then issuing the commandment. And then you look at the list of currently active commandments, and it tells you exactly what you actually said to them, and some of it can be rather confusing. So to give you a prime example, I issued a commandment to have my followers hunt the nearby antelopes because they needed more food. And instead of hunting them, because what I put was for the hungry followers to produce antelopes, instead of hunting them, what they did was actually go and feed them. There wasn't an option for hunting. The only thing that came close was destroy, and I was like, okay, well, I'll throw that in there instead. And thus I had two commandments active at the same time, one to feed the antelopes and the other to destroy them. It was kind of ridiculous, actually. Even more fun was when I issued a commandment to old people to produce death, and I wasn't entirely sure what that was going to do, but it ended up making them actually try to kill all the other followers. So basically, the few old people I still had left at that time actually went on a homicidal rampage, which is a pretty hilarious mental image. But I would do things like tell followers to create alliances, and all of a sudden they'd be fighting each other, or I would tell them to produce food, and sometimes they would comply and sometimes they wouldn't. It just depended. It's hard to figure out exactly how your followers are going to react to things, and it's even harder to try to tailor your commandments to that. Even then, just as a control, I decided to try just letting them loose and not bothering with anything, not even touching the commandments at all. And they actually worked out fine, because the way it's currently set up, you don't really have all that much influence over them, and they're going to actually go for their basic needs anyway. So in its current state, you end up with a game that has a lot of potential to be really interesting, and a game where you can actually do some pretty amusing things when they misinterpret what you're saying, but you don't really feel like you have enough influence over them, and you don't really feel like it has a lasting effect. The commandments expire after a certain amount of time, and then you have to either start them anew, or you have to start new commandments, and there's no real way to generate any proper history with anything. It's one of the big tenets of the game to actually generate this unique history with your followers, but when you get down to it, you can't really do that. There is no mechanic that accounts for legacy at this point. So what you're left with is a bunch of extremely myopic followers. They can see only right in front of them, and that's pretty much it. You're not ever really given enough information to determine what your followers actually need. I mean, why are they unhappy? I don't know. Why are they happy? I don't know. They have the exact same things for both of them. They both have the exact same amount of food, they both have the exact same amount of procreation, and even the same amount of metal production, and yet one place is happy and the other place is unhappy. Why? I don't know. Again, the game doesn't give you enough information to really understand what your followers are needing and why they are the way they are at any given point. Maybe that's intentional, I don't really know, but it's certainly a possibility, and in fact it would actually make for a relatively interesting one. We'll just have to wait and see on this one to see if the additional mechanics that they're trying to put in and the additional polish they're trying to put together is actually going to be enough to actually make this a compelling game. Because as it stands, it's a really great idea, but it's just not very interesting to play. It's a simulation without much gameplay, and you just end up sitting there waiting most of the time. So in its current build, it's actually fairly boring, and I don't really recommend getting into it early unless you really want to support the game's development. But if you want to know how it is as a game, I certainly will be taking a look at the full release version whenever that does eventually come out. But in its current state, it's a cool idea with a lot of potential, but not much more than that right now. Again, we'll just have to wait and see how this one actually turns out once the full version rolls around. Hopefully it's a lot better by then. Thanks for watching.